Welcome back to our Florida podcast. I'm your host, May. On Fridays, I discuss one of Florida's diverse wildlife and
I'm Kaylee.
ecosystems.
I am your other host. On Mondays, I talk about a part of Florida history. This last week, I shared about the Sunshine Skyway Bridge collapse in 1980.
This week's episode, if you have ever been to the beach and experienced dead fish lying on the beach, a rotten smell, and when breathing the air around you, it starts to burn your throat or make you cough, if so, you have most likely experienced red tide. This week's episode will focus on red tide, the common name for a harmful algae bloom, however we want to call it. Red tide has been documented in the southern Gulf of Mexico since the 1700s and reported in the Florida Gulf Coast since the 1840s. So, what is the Florida red tide? Red tide is considered a higher than normal concentration of a microscopic algae. Scientists typically refer to red tide as a Carina brevis, K. brevis, lots of different names for this. But essentially, this is an organism that produces a toxin that affects the central nervous system of fish. Each year, the red tide bloom is caused by microscopic algae that produce toxins that kill fish, make shellfish dangerous to eat, and make it difficult to breathe for animals and humans that breathe in the surrounding air. When there are high amounts, it's considered a bloom. Sometimes a full bloom may cause water discoloration, like a red or brown hue, and even when an algae is in full bloom, it may not even discolor the water at all.
I guess that's where
So while red tide is a
where
natural...
red tide comes from, is the color of the algae, not just like I always thought of it as like the fish are dead, so it's like blood or something.
Yeah, technically, yeah, it's just like the way the water turns. Technically, like I said, scientists don't actually call it red tide at all. It's kind of a name that we've just kind of given it. I don't know how it's been described originally and stuff. I don't think I've actually ever seen where the water's been brown or red from red tide. I've never seen it. I've smelled it. I've dealt with red, like we've been at the beach when the red tide's very, very prominent. But I've never seen it where like the different color changes or anything like that in the water. While red tide is a natural phenomenon, its frequency, duration, and severity continue to worsen because of significant nitrogen and phosphorus inputs into the ocean from fertilizer and wastewater. So, to clarify, like I said, red tide is partially natural. It's to be expected. It is an algae bloom, and not all algae blooms are this bad. But because of fertilizers, wastewater, couple different factors, it typically makes the blooms a lot worse than what they ever should be or have to be. Red tide in Florida usually occurs in late summer to early fall and typically blooms 10 to 40 miles offshore. Now, okay, I don't necessarily believe that. I feel like in our experiences, it's usually like end of spring, or like I feel like it was more spring than summer, than less like a summer to fall. But
I'm trying to think.
I'm just a Floridian, that's all. I looked up a lot of sources and they all said the same thing. But there have been years where it's occurred like nonstop.
I think
like
it was
red tide
last
just
year,
never
the
went
year
away,
before,
basically.
that it was really bad in February, and everyone was freaking out. Like, if it's bad in February, how bad is it going to be in the summer? I do think it is probably a little more typical for summer. That sounds right. I'm trying to think. So most of my experience with red tide, at least as an adult, is my husband he's a drummer. So he plays out on Siesta Key and all these open air venues right by the beach. And when it gets bad, I just cannot go because my eyes water, my throat, my lungs burn. Like, I can't do it. He'll come in sounding all raspy, like he's getting sick or something. So, and I feel like usually it's in the warmth, but I know there was a bad one in February a year or two ago that really like kind of set everyone off. Like, this is not normal.
There was, yeah. So in the past, we've had algae blooms last as long as 2 years. And so it's really hard to predict when the harmful algae bloom will take place. However, once we are able to locate it, it can be predicted in what direction it will head based on wind and water data. So typically they're kind of able to get this information about 3 to 3.5 days beforehand. And so Florida Fish and Wildlife usually goes out weekly and they provide, like, based on counties, of a map of what the counts are for red tide, how much expected, how bad will it be, and so they give a rough estimate for it. Now, as of the week that we were recording this episode, March 14th, Florida Fish and Wildlife currently has no counts listed on their weekly update, so as of this week, when we're recording, it seems to be pretty good. And you can go to Florida Fish and Wildlife on a weekly basis and get that update. But as the counts start to get higher, you'll see it on the news, and there'll be lots of different. I mean, I think it gets included with like your
Yeah,
weather.
I think it's
You'll be able to
exceptionally
see it
bad.
and
There's
get the
also like a
information on it
beach
too.
tracker that if you're like, I want to go out to the beach today, you can go on there and it will give you all of the conditions. Like, is there red tide symptoms? Are there, I think they even do like fecal counts and stuff in the water. You get wind directions, all of that stuff. So if you're
They
ever
do.
like, I want to, but I really don't know, and I'm tired of hearing all the hoopla on Facebook, go directly to the source.
Yeah, exactly. So essentially, once they figure out the direction that it's headed in, that's when they go ahead and start getting as much information as they can. The bloom itself can be carried into shallow coastal waters like bays and estuaries, but red tide typically can't handle low salinity. So like if it's too low, they won't be able to, basically can't bloom. So once it's in estuaries, once it gets high enough up, typically it doesn't bloom, and so it usually doesn't affect it too badly. However, how does red tide affect wildlife, plant life, and humans? Corinnia,
How does
is
this?
it Corinnia or is it Corinna?
I think it's
I feel like it
however.
could go
I think it's
both
whatever.
ways. Cool. For
Perfect.
the purpose of this podcast, we're going to call it Corinnia. Corinnia brevis produces potent neurotoxins that affect the health of wildlife and people. Brevitoxins can cause respiratory irritation or illness if inhaled, and if shellfish are consumed that are contaminated, it will cause neurotoxic shellfish poisoning. The amount of times I saw shellfish in this episode and the amount of times I said Sally sells seashells by the seashore and could say it fine, but every time I try to say shellfish, it
Shellfish
doesn't go
drinking
as
game
well.
with my liqueur.
There we go. Red tide harms manatees each year just by ingesting and or inhaling the brevitoxins produced by the red tide organisms. When ingesting, it can take several weeks of eating seagrass or taking in seawater before starting to take effect. Waves can easily break open the cells and release the toxins in the air, and so when manatees surface to breathe, they are unable to. As well, brevitoxins cause seizures, which typically will drown the manatee first. So manatees are having seizures after so long, and usually once they've had a seizure, if it's not reported, the manatee will go ahead and drown, and that's all that can
Oh,
be
that's so
done at that
terrible.
point.
I said, oh, that's
When
so
we have
terrible.
what? Yeah, I didn't know that. I had no idea. Which I guess makes sense, like
Yeah.
neurotoxins and such, but and it like short circuits the yeah. Yeah. When we have large amounts of red tide bloom, it can reduce the amount of light that seagrass needs to continue growth, eliminating a food source for manatees. Most manatees will require medical attention to survive if severely affected by red tide, and the only way they get that medical attention is if it's being reported by boaters or if you spot a manatee and you see strange behavior. The only way they're going to get that attention is if it's reported and spotted. In 2023, 110 manatee carcasses were collected with the known red tide bloom boundary, and around 30 were red tide positive, and the remaining 80 were suspected to have been from red tide. So out of that 110, they definitely knew for a fact that there were about 30 or so that had died from red tide, and that the 80 other were suspected to have had red tide basically be like a major
Yikes.
contributing factor. Yeah. So, manatees are not the only ones affected. Dolphins, lots of different animals or marine animals are affected each year by red tide. Around hundreds to thousands of dead fish wash up on beaches and shores that have been killed by the bloom. And usually they'll sit on the shore like you. I mean, I think I've been a couple times to the beach where you just see like rows of dead fish on the ocean. It smells horrible, as you can imagine. So you've got red tide in the picture, and then you just honestly have rotting fish along the beach line, and it smells pretty bad. So red tide is an harmful algae that causes lots of respiratory issues for us, for manatees, for dolphins, for fish. It's overall causes a lot of issues. And like we kind of said in the beginning, while it is expected on a certain level naturally, the length that we have had it stay for 2 years or more than a couple months is really the issue, as well as the increasing amount of blooms affecting food resources for manatees and things is really like parts of the major issue of red tide. Um, Honestly, I learned way more about red tide than I ever thought I would ever want to know. And I also, when doing some research, I also quickly realized there are lots of opinions on what causes red tide. I found numerous news reports that have stories lacking very little scientific information, but basically Tampa and the fees were they dumping billions of gallons of sewage water leading to a high bloom count. There just seems to be some news article about that. There's articles where sewage water was dumped because of hurricanes and natural disasters. Essentially, there was just a lot of information, but not too much scientifically. It seems that red tide has been worse in the years where we contributed to higher amounts of waste being dumped into our waters, or when natural disasters occur like hurricanes, resulting in the sewage water and all different types of waste to be
That
dumped
makes
in our
sense. So it's
coastal
like
water.
the excess nitrogen and nutrients from
So,
that causes more algae to bloom, and then you have more effects. Also
yeah,
makes sense to me
exactly.
too, because any comment section in a Facebook group about a beach on Florida, eventually you're going to get to the topic of red tide, and it's always there's people that are like, it's completely natural, and you have people like, this never used to happen. It's only because they dumped the sewage or because they did this, that, and the other. It's like most things. No, you both are right, you know. Like it is natural, but we're also making things exceptionally bad with extra unnatural activities. Yeah.
I think this is like the second or third time we've brought up Facebook and like the things that you see online, like from social media about people being like, oh, but it's this, but it's that. And they're both right and they're both also wrong. I think we need to start a series about just myth busting about Florida's wildlife and how it works and just be like, no, but here's how this is also right and how you're
Yeah.
also still
There's
wrong.
a
But here we go.
nuance.
I think it should become a series. I love this. I love us. Okay. All right. Well, that is the information that basically I learned scientifically about red tide. I started going down a rabbit hole a little bit about, what is the cause of red tide? What is everything? But I did find a timeline of red tide starting in like 1840s. It just kind of shares some information about one, as a state, how did we look at red tide? Globally, how did we start looking at red tide? How long did it take for us to start actually doing research? And also, how long did it take for us to actually start putting money into things? And the years that I'm going to go through, there are more years where there was other things that were done, but these are just some of the significant years that I'm going to go through just to clarify. So, in the 16th century, a Spanish explorer documents stories of toxic red waters and seeing the death of birds and fish. So, I imagine that's where we partially get our red tide name for it, and that's kind of where it gets started. 1844. We get our first scientifically recorded red tide episode in U.S. waters off the Panhandle near Panama City. Record rains in 1947 in the Panhandle show a massive red tide bloom along the Florida Gulf Coast. This nearly lasted a year and just about destroyed the commercial fishing industry, and it kills the sponge beds near Tarpon Springs because of the effects of the red tide that year and how bad the conditions were. Beach areas were evacuated, hotels and schools were also all closed until it was cleared up. So, 1947, this is the start where they believe that rain and how much rain they get and what's being put in the water is going to take a huge effect. And it did greatly affect them that year. Hotels, schools, and beach areas were all evacuated and shut down for the time being because of the air conditions, water conditions, all sorts of different things. So that's just kind of the start of it. A couple years later, in 1953, the longest single red tide episode is recorded, and that lasts for around 18 months, staying along the Florida Gulf Coast. In 1996, after having a 2-year red tide bloom, in 1994, the red tide returned to the Gulf again in January. So 1994, or I'm sorry, 1953, we had an 18 months long stay for red tide. 1994, we had a 2-year time. And then in 1996, the red tide returned to the Gulf again in January. And during this time, in just about a month, it extended from Pinellas County nearly all the way down south to the Keys. This in 1996, it killed about 238 manatees, and then at that time, that was about 10% of
Wow.
the total population.
That's crazy. That's so much. And
Yeah.
also so long to be dealing with that.
Yeah, so much. And such a long time to be dealing with that. Such a long time and also it's like such a long time, but also basically it took about a month, only a month for it to extend all the way from Pinellas County all
Yeah,
the way
that's the
down to
entire
South
Gulf
Florida into
Coast
the
just
Keys.
taken out. And like everywhere along the
That's
coast, you've
crazy.
got businesses
The
and
whole Gulf
restaurants
Coast.
and schools and yeah, yikes.
Yeah. And this is just looking at Florida. So if we take a look at red tide globally, if you look at 1903, red tide occurs for the first time in the North Sea. It's thought that the algae was brought in or carried in on tankers from Japan and Australia. In 1972, so a pretty big jump, we went from 1903 to 1972, red tide algae invaded New England for the first time, closing shellfish beds from Maine to
Yikes.
Cape Cod.
Gulf.
In 1975, Hong Kong has their first recorded red tide, as well as in 1991, a bloom in Norway kills large numbers of farm-raised salmon, and then in 2005, the worst toxic bloom in New England history shuts down fisheries from Maine to
Wow.
Martha's Vineyard. So a huge section, also very both sides, like, Maine to Martha's Vineyard, and also for even our side. Like, these are all very big touristy season. So we're completely shutting these things down. So it's affecting not just the fact of like, it's affecting our waters and our wildlife, but also we're just taking out income for a lot of different people and the way that a lot of people are making their livings, basically. So, um, basically, throughout the years, scientists and people have started to have their own ideas and reasons why red tide blooms and were worse stem years and happening more frequently. So, in 1947, a widespread rumor blames that the red tide bloom on leftover World War II gases and chemicals thought to have been dumped into the Gulf by the U.S. military. In 1953, a Florida scientist suggested blasting red tide with copper sulfate. This is a chemical commonly used to kill algae in reservoirs. They did go ahead and try this in 1957 and quickly learned that the
Oh,
chemical killed all plant
cool.
life. Nice. I was like,
Don't
ooh,
worry,
good. All
manatees. You're
right.
not going to
This
have a
is a good one.
seizure. You're just going to starve slowly for the next several months. Congratulations.
Here we go. And more than months, I
Yeah,
mean,
sorry.
way more than
Interrupting an
months,
entire
but yeah,
generation's life
here's this
cycle.
idea. Also, keep that in mind. Literally, keep that in mind for what I'm about to say also, because I found it kind of very redundant in so many ways. So that was 1957. In 1995, Korea announced that it had solved its red tide by spraying the algae blooms with a clay compound that reduced its fishing losses from $100 million to $1 million in a single year. However, American scientists did warn and expressed that the impact of the clay on marine life is unknown. So, we just talked about in 57 where they just sprayed a chemical that ended up killing all of plant life. But in 1995, when Korea decides that they're going to spray clay, American scientists turn around and be like, yeah, well, we don't actually know what the marine life, we don't know what it's going to do to our marine life. Well, I don't know. I just think I'm not saying they're not wrong. I'm not saying they're
Heavy
not wrong, but I
metals?
just find
Let's do heavy
the
metals.
logic behind it's very
Dirt?
interesting.
No. Dirt? We don't know. We don't know.
No, no dirt. Can't use dirt. Yeah. So, in 1997, Australian scientists say that minerals in the smoke from island wildfires fed the bloom, which killed fish and coral for hundreds of miles in Indonesia. And then in 2001, a scientific study commissioned by the U.S. Congress leaks greater incidence with severity of algae blooms due to global warming. However, at this time, global warming is not officially recognized by the United States. So in 2002, the University of South Florida researchers say that red tide may be caused by iron in clouds of dust blowing from the Sahara Desert to the Gulf. That one sounds a little crazy to me, but I don't know anything about it, so I don't know. But so far we've got a lot. So we've got World War II that's been dumped, then that's causing it. We've got smoke from island wildfires that's killing fish in Indonesia. We've got global warming's come into the picture. We've got iron and clouds of dust blowing from the Sahara Desert. And then we've got, well, when we killed all of our plant life in 57. So we've got lots of contributing factors and opinions and beliefs on what is causing red tide, and specifically what's causing it to stay for so long. Not so much of why it's here, just why it's there for so long. So all the speculation, some of the research that has been done for red tide started in 1974. The first international conference on toxic blooms, aka red tide, is held in Boston. So we've got internationally, all came to Boston. We all started talking about it, which is good. The Marine Lab in Sarasota holds its first workshop for red tide researchers and is monitoring outbreaks as its priority. So this is Moat Marine in Sarasota if you've ever been. In 1996, Congress allocates funds for the very first time to study red tide, and that's about 1.5 million grant. This represents the first time red tide is going to be reviewed by policymakers and as a national issue. As well, in 1997, NASA launches a red tide detecting satellite because they were able to actually be able to spot it. I actually did not get into too much information about what that satellite is, but if I find out some more, I'll go ahead and
It
include it
definitely
in my
speaks
post
to
so
the
that it can be
size
read
of how
about.
big these blooms are if you can spot them from space.
They can be spotted, like very, very visibly be spotted. Yeah. Moving forward, we start dumping a little bit more money into research. So 1998, Florida makes a serious investment in red tide research with $1 million grant to Moat Marine and the State Fish and Wildlife Research Institute. 1999, Florida triples its investment into research by $3 million. In 2004, it's finally acknowledged that red tide has a $1 billion impact on the national economy, so the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association announces a plan to step up, and then in 2005, Moat Marine concludes a 5-year study. There may have been an increase in frequency and severity of algae blooms in the Gulf. Moat Marine states its emphasis on monitoring outbreaks, estimating an adequate system could cost $50 million to build and $8 million a year to operate. So basically, they did the 5-year study. It came to the conclusion that it's going to cost a lot of money. And so, like I said, this is just kind of the brief time frame. This is kind of from the last update I had from that this was 2005. But overall, to me, it seems that red tide is ultimately caused in a greater amount due to runoff, and we're dumping it into our water system. Now, again, I am no scientist, not a scientist at all. So just for the record, to put it into perspective, and why I come to that conclusion that it's really what we're putting in our water is contributing. In 1947, there's a scientist institute that studies the Florida red tide that says the excessive nutrient content may be the result of heterogeneous contamination or fertilization of the waters. In 1953, another marine scientist said that red tide may be a coastal phenomena associated with heavy land drainage. Researchers at Manhattan's laboratories report that freshwater runoff contributes to red tide bloom by reducing the salinity of ocean water and boosting levels of various nutrients as fish begin to die from the toxin bacteria attacking the carcasses further feed the algae creating a biological
Gotcha. So
chain
our
reaction.
runoff, whether it's like, sewage waste from the storm or our freshwater runoff from like farms and dairies and all of that, feeds the bloom. The bloom kills the fish. The fish dying releases more nutrients and feeds the bloom again.
Exactly. You said it so much better. Woohoo! All right. So, moving forward into 1962, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers reports that red tide blooms are correlated with use of high rainfall and heavy freshwater discharge from the western rivers of the Florida Peninsula. This discharge says that the corps seem to bring in some nutrient, which leads to bloom when other conditions are just right. So basically, kind of what we've already learned that we were saying in 1953, now 1962, the U.S. Army engineers, they're with the program, they agree. In 1996, it said that there is no conclusive evidence of a relationship between land-based runoff of nutrients from fertilizers and industrial waste. Marine acknowledges that red tide is producing algae, but may exploit nutrients, and that may be contributing to longer and bigger blooms. Meanwhile, a research
So in 1996, they're saying that there's not a correlation between runoff and that. They're saying like that's just conjecture. Okay.
yeah, that's what they're trying to say. Yeah. Yeah. Um, so while they're trying to say that, same time, a senior researcher at the Woods Hole Marine Lab in Massachusetts says that mounting evidence is overwhelming that there is a link between such pollution and red tide blooms. That same year, a federal panel meeting in Sarasota is set up to discuss red tide research and recommended that governmental bodies seek to control and reduce industrial and agricultural waste as a possible means of mitigating red tide. I feel like for many years now, it's been very clear and very much so pointing that it's fertilizer, industrial waste, whatever the case may be, runoff. And then 1996, for whatever reason, we've got someone that's trying to say that, like, no, it
Followed
can't be
up with
that.
two
And
other.
then there's too much evidence and research going that, like, actually, there's no way that this is not basically our issue. So, an environmental scientist, Robert Howard of Cornell University, who chaired a federal study that recommended stricter policing of runoff for a variety of environmental reasons, says that human activities more than doubled the amount of nitrogen produced in the world between 1960 to 1990. And more than half of that increase is from fertilizers, and that brings us to 2006, where Sarasota County Commission considered the proposal to restrict the use of some fertilizers as a means of limiting runoff linked by red tide, and then the commission plans a series of public meetings and such discuss the matter and hoping to lessen how long red tide stays yearly. So we had lots of debate until the scientist Robert Howard came forward and said that, like, no, the amount of nitrogen that was been produced between the 30 years from 1960 to 1990 is more than half of
And it
increase, and
lines
all
up
that's
with
coming
like
from fertilizers and such.
the red tide expanding
Here's
its
our
area.
issue:
Yeah, expanding the
our years
area,
that we had
the
like the
time, all of it
worst.
makes sense if there's
Yeah,
that much more feeding it. Yeah.
exactly. So that is the end of the timeline, finally. I felt a little ridiculous reading all of that. And again, this is only some of the years. I probably could have spent like I could have read off just so many other years and different things that we were going back and forth. It feels like we put lots of money and time where it seems mostly to point that the cause of our extended periods of red tide is directly resulting from what we're dumping into our waters or runoff or chemicals and excessive amounts of rain, which excessive amounts of rain is fine. It's when we get
Well,
this
that's being
excessive amounts
used.
of
It's just
rain
going to
while
get
all
washed away. Yeah. You can't
is
stop the rain. We need the rain. But if we are
exactly.
not having, gallons of fertilizers and cow poop and even dog poop contributes and stuff, like all of that. If our sewage facilities aren't being properly funded so
All
that
lots
they
of
can
different things,
handle
yeah.
the extra and handle it during hurricane season, then like all of that's getting flushed out into the Gulf, which is gross in its own so many ways, anyways.
It is, yeah. Think
Yeah.
about it, like, we swim in these waters too, so it's gross. So what are we doing now? How are we trying to limit the spread and time frame the red thyme is blooming for? The idea is that we would be able to reduce nutrient pollution and fertilizer runoff, as well currently developing and testing new technologies, and one of those technologies being a clay flocculation. So this uses clay particles to burst the algae cells. Then the cells would sink and deposit to the bottom and to be dispersed by natural currents. So it kind of sounds to me kind of what Japan was doing that I talked about in the beginning of the episode, where they were spraying it and that was solving their algae problem. Now, I currently it's still being tested on,
Of course.
what's the impact to our wildlife and such. So ideally, this would be an environmentally friendly and inexpensive, as well as easily scalable over large areas. So far, they have done experiments and field applications in China and Korea. However, there have been few studies showing the impacts on wildlife. So for now, we continue to focus on fertilizer runoff and
Reducing. Yeah.
reducing pollution in our waterways, just to clarify, as well as proving public awareness and education. So Still in the works. I do think it's been getting a lot better slowly, but also really we've got to limit how much wastewater chemicals, fertilization stuff is going in our waterways to see an impact. If we were able to control that, I don't think there would be such a need to be going out there and
Probably
doing it.
something.
But I'm assuming it's more so like they can only control, I'm assuming, so much from wastewaters and things than what they're anticipating, that it'd be better and easier to find a solution to go through and eliminate some of the algae to
Yeah.
stop the bloom
Well, I
for
imagine it's going
lasting
to come
so
down a
long.
lot to like policy at county levels. So going to those meetings, or at least knowing what's happening, knowing like your commissioners and who you're voting in and where they stand on that. So like knowing the facts that it's yeah, no,
It's
now
going to be
now that we
extremely
can go, yes,
important.
this is natural, but we're making it worse and we need to reduce these things. Now you can look at it, okay, now I need to vote for the people that are handling the issue, that are talking about the runoff, that are talking about the wastewater treatment and everything, making sure that as new houses and new developments are going in, that we're having the budget to handle that and handle that expansion in all of the facilities. So that's going to be critical to making sure that like we've got clean drinking water and everything. Not to mention, like, I know people be like, who cares about the tourists
Yeah.
anyways? Well, one, it is a lot of our income, but also like there's so many small businesses and just individual people that work as waiters and waitresses and musicians out on the beaches and stuff. So there's a lot of small people it really, really affects too. It's not just like these big hotels, you know. I'm not worried about Marriott.
No, no, not at all. But overall, this concludes this week's episode on red tide. We would love to hear it and for you to share your own opinions about the causes of red tide. If you have any of your own insight, I am happy to hear it. I did honestly kind of enjoy going through and being like, this kind of seems silly, but also this is very factual and makes a lot of sense. So I do enjoy it. So if you've got your own opinions, I'd love to hear them.
No, I don't think
Anything you want to
so.
go ahead and add,
Thank you
Kaylee?
guys for listening and for joining us. If, like I said, if you enjoyed the episode, share with a friend. I really appreciate having more facts to like base my arguments off of. Not that I engage with Facebook comments really, but I like being able to have good conversations when I'm going to be out in Siesta Key and people are complaining that there's red tide, and you know, I can have an educated conversation now. So I really appreciate that and you doing this episode. Um, Follow us, subscribe, and all of that, all the good stuff. Send us an email at our floridapodcast@gmail.com, and I hope you have a great week. Bye.
Bye.